G'day, John. This is Syd Gooding, John Harris's friend, the bloke that you referred to in your tape. Anyhow, the first thing I'd like to say is thank you very much for the still photographs and the videotape of Gainsborough. I didn't realise I had such a poor memory of the place, and this has refreshed them. And, of course, refreshed my memories of the glorious days of flying Lancs around Lincolnshire. Also, I must thank you for the film on the Lancaster's innards. John was up here just the other day and he showed me the film. And I was making sure your friend was doing the right cockpit drill. And I felt as though I was there myself, and it was most enjoyable indeed. However, when your friend asked about my group and squadron, I decided I could give him that pretty well, and I've checked the logbook for accuracy, but that wouldn't be much on a tape, so I thought perhaps I'd go right back to the day when I first saw an aeroplane and take you through my experience throughout the years. So sit back, take it easy, and here goes. The first aeroplane I ever saw was when I was a kid of 4 in 1920. And my dad was a blacksmith and worked at a place called Mount Pleasant in the Adelaide Hills. And we lived out of town a short way, and I was the last of the family and sort of a lonely kid, but I always seemed to be able to occupy myself. However, one of the things of interest was the local squatter had a car, and it used to trundle past our place every second day or so, and it was, well, I don't know what it was, but it had a fabric hood and had straps holding the hood to the windscreens, and they were hooked onto the front of the mudguards. I can remember big brass lights, probably acetylene lights, and also the big brass radiator. Anyhow, I was always alerted to its approach by the sound of the motor. And on this particular day, I was outside messing around, and as kids do, and I could hear the sound of a motor, and I looked up the road, couldn't see the car, and looked again, and then all of a sudden, over the back of the house, there's an aeroplane zooming up over the hill. Obviously a pilot having a beat up. Well, years later I recognised it in a magazine, and it was a Bristol monoplane fighter which had not seen action because it came into production late in the 14-18 war. And oddly enough, about 10 years later, when I was at a pageant at Parafield, that's the Adelaide Aerodrome at the time, I spotted this thing, and I'd refitted the engine and replaced the old rotary with a Gypsy Major. And blow me down if it didn't win the pilot race. Anyway, back to Mount Pleasant. The old man never seemed to be out of a job, but to keep up this occupation of blacksmithing, we shortly after that went to a place called Sudan, which is in the Malay country, and the Malay is rather a short multi-trunk eucalypt, and when the land is cleared, it proved to be very good farming country for wheat. We didn't stay at Sudan very long, and there wasn't any aircraft in the vicinity, but from there the old man went to Berry, a soldier settlement on the Murray, up near the Victorian border. And I spent about 8 years there going to school. And again, my interest was roused by the mail planes that flew from the neighbouring town, Renmark, down to Adelaide, and I used to go over Berry, and I used to look at them till they were out of sight. There was a Fokker Universal, and later a DH-50, the same type of aeroplane that Cobham flew to South Africa on the occasion when an Arab took a pot shot and shot his engineer. And that then was about the limit of aeroplanes, except that one day Captain Francis and his gypsy moth came and landed in the common next to our footy field. The kids were let out of school and we ran down half a mile to see this wonder. An interesting thing was that the old captain wanted to refuel, and he asked the crowd to push the aeroplane across the road where he refueled at the local garage. And then he took off and went down to the common below the town where there's much more room. So away went the kids again, and in those days 5 bob was a fortune, which I didn't have, but I sat and watched every movement of that aeroplane on its takeoff runs. And this brought the Association of Aeroplanes at Berry to a halt. The depression started to bloom and the old ad went out of business, so we found ourselves shifting once again. We went to Nuruyutpa in the Barossa Valley, only about 40 miles from Adelaide. The Barossa Valley is famous for its wines, and this little place, Nuruyutpa, put me in range of parafields, where I went to saw the little old Bristol monoplane win that race I mentioned earlier. Now, it was at Nuruyutpa where I was able to get my first flight. I used to read Aircraft magazine, and there was a competition for a flying model, the prize being an hour's flight over Adelaide. I made the model, took it down to the Aero Club where they had collected the entrance models, and about a month later I got a letter to say that I had won the competition. Now this was a doubtful honour because I was the only kid in Australia who'd made it, and because I was the only one, they could not give me the hour flight, but they'd give me consolation of 20 minutes. So when Dad was going to Adelaide, he dropped me off at Parafield, and I went and hung around. Eventually the pilot to fly the machine came out. I can remember him quite distinctly. He was a huge fellow, and his name was Rice Oxley. Anyhow, away we went, climbed up, and I was hoping to get aerobatics, but all he did was give me a stall, and I thought I'd lost my stomach on the first experience of stalling an aeroplane. After that, back to Nuruyutpa, and because we're not far from Adelaide, one day in-lumbered a big DH-9 and landed in one of the farms there. Another mile walk, but by this time I had a few bob in my pocket, and I went out, and joyrides were again 5 bob, and the old DH-9 had 2 side-by-side seats in front of the pilot, and another one behind. And again, it was a great experience to waft up into the air among the birds. Not long after this, the old dad became restless again and decided to take the family up to North Queensland. We set off in 2 vehicles, and after trekking for 3 weeks, we'd covered 2,100 miles. Their destination was a place called Ayr, which is 60 miles south of Townsville, and it was the most extraordinary place regards leisure. There was surfing, and there was boating on the Burdekin, there were channels in the delta, and there was fish there galore, crabs, prawns. But north was a big river, again offering those succulent pieces of food, and there was hunting, and there was the militia unit, there was skating, field games, there was dancing, and 2 weeks at picture show, and I indulged in the lot. Fortune smiled on one of the local blokes in that he won £6,000 in the state lottery. And shortly after, he bought himself a gypsy moth. I believe it was for £350. I used to trundle out to the landing field and watch him with great envy as he practiced circuits and bumps. Shortly after that, he sold the machine and then bought a push moth. And at this time, I was saving a little bit of money so that I could get back to South Australia for a holiday at least. And I'd accrued something like 30 quid, which I kept in a tobacco tin. And I thought this bloke might teach me to fly. And when I approached him, he little reluctantly said, "Oh, yes, so you'd see." I didn't pursue the matter, but a couple of nights later, I went to the picture show, and there's a sign saying, "Fly with SK Howard of the Queensland Aero Club." I thought, God, strike me pink. This is what I want. So I went and withdrew my intentions of flying with the local bloke and appeared out at the drone when the Queensland Aero Club plane came in. I dipped into my savings of 30 quid and took a few quid with me and went out to see SK Howard and said, "I'd like half an hour's instruction. If I felt I was doing something right, I would continue with the flying instructions." So away we went, and by golly was I ever thrilled. Of course, instructions, I had hold of the prong and I manoeuvred the aeroplane gently this way and that, and I was hooked. I went solo at 6 hours 40, and when I had accrued 10 hours, I was able to go for the A licence. This was more or less just an authority to take the aeroplane without the instructor's presence or a pre-check before taking off. To follow this, there was the Advanced A licence course, which took you into emergency landings, cross countries, short circuits, climbing turns off the deck, and side slipping, spinning, etc., etc. I was about halfway through this course when the old man's restlessness urged him to go somewhere else, and we finished up going to Taree on the Manning River, which is about 100 miles north of Newcastle in New South Wales. When I got there, I was that poor I could hardly scratch myself. There was a militia unit at Taree, which I joined, and on our first camp trip down near Newcastle, the weekend pay we got for the camp gave me a few extra bob, so on our day off I sneaked into the Newcastle Aero Club and had the experience of flying a BA Swallow, which is a British version of the Clem Swallow, the German aircraft. Most extraordinary thing, you couldn't spin it, you couldn't overbank it, and you couldn't stall it. It was fitted with a Popjoy engine, a little radial of 7 cylinders, high revving, weighed 75 pounds and produced about 75 horsepower. And because of its high revs, it was a geared engine to reduce the props to the appropriate speed onto the prop. It was probably one of the first geared prop engines to ever put onto an aircraft. Incidentally, the Popjoy was on the small aircraft Compass Swift that the Australian Arthur Butler flew from England to Australia in record time. And the Compass Swift was later fitted with the Gypsy Major engine and won many of the King's Cup races that the Aero Clubs used to hold in England. My next journey aloft was when the militia camped at Liverpool near Sydney, and on the weekend again I went into the Aero Club and I spotted a sports trainer, Ryan, beautiful little aeroplane, and the most well-proportioned one I think I've ever seen. It was a wire-braced low-wing monoplane, and it cruised about 135 against about 75 of the gypsies, and the only thing that was a bug was the engine. The Monasco was used to pop push rods, but to fly, it was beautifully manoeuvrable and an absolute delight to look at. Thus ended my flying for the next couple of years. About 12 months after that, I realised it was time for me to flip the nest. Things were getting a bit strained with the old man and myself, so I took off this time and went to Sydney and had the opportunity of learning a trade under the subsidised training apprenticeship scheme. I got a job with an engineering firm, and the pay was great. And when I settled into the routine, I decided that I'd go to the Aero Club, joined up, and I started flying again. We had an interesting few aeroplanes. We had the Gypsy Moth, which I was familiar with. We had the Tiger Moth, the Hornet Moth, and a Moth Minor, which was a monoplane preceding the Chipmunk, which became so famous at a later stage. With such an opportunity to learn the trade, I decided to dedicate myself to study at Tech. So I gave the militia away, and the other times I danced, skated, surfed, and generally had a good time. I'd been in the job for about 2 years, and suddenly the war burst upon us. I hadn't even thought about that. I was living it a bit on the high side. Anyhow, I finished the trade and go in, and then eventually I couldn't resist having a go at the Air Force. So I went down to the recruiting centre, passed everything, and it came to the final question, what's your occupation? And I was too honest and said, subsidised trainee apprentice. They dragged out a great stamp and went bang on the papers, reserved occupation. And here I was, a soldier in peacetime and reserved occupation. I thought I was embarrassed. Anyhow, back to the job, and at about this time I got promoted to charge hand and a 2 quid rise. I thought, wacko, I can get some more flying in. So from then on, averaged about $1 million hour a week, so that my totals were creeping up. Anyhow, also at about that time, or perhaps a bit later, the great friend who learned to fly at the same time as I did turns up in Air Force uniform. That was really rubbing salt in the wound. But the boss eventually found out I could fly, and he was very interested in aeroplanes, as I found out. And when he assured himself that I really could fly, and I wasn't kidding, he took me down the back of the shop and showed me a helicopter he'd made way back many years before. It was powered with little compressed air motors. Anyway, he used to come down and offer ideas about engines and ask me questions about aeroplanes, and quite a friendship sprung up, which wasn't quite the norm for a fitting and turning shop in those days. But I was a country lad, and I couldn't care less what the city boys thought. And I could talk to the boss, and I liked him very much. Anyhow, this association proved pretty good, because when I had finished my time, the old boss came down and said, don't come in work clothes on Monday. Walking out, I'll take you down and sign your release. Which he did do, and 6 weeks later I was in the Air Force. Well, you couldn't believe my relief. We went out to Bradfield Park, one of the suburbs where they had the reception centres and also initial training school. And here we were, Air Force bods, blue berets, blue overalls, marching around in queues from hut to hut, learning all the ground subjects necessary to make us good airmen. Of course, the majority of people wanted to be pilots. I felt rather smug because I had nearly 60 hours solo and about 30 hours dual. I thought that should ensure that I get in, but I didn't count my chickens. I hoped and hoped and hoped, and finally we went up before the selection board. Now, the old head of the selection board said, "Why do you want to be a pilot?" I said, "Sir, I've got 60 hours flying solo and about 30 hours dual." And he said, "Well, when you get out to our training units, don't think you know everything." And I still didn't believe it until I saw my name on the list for pilot training. We were shunted out to Narrandera on the Murrumbidgee River, about 200 miles west of Sydney in the flat open country. And when my instructor came up and said, "You're flying with me, I believe you've got some flying experience." And I could see what he was getting at, and I said, "Sir, that's civil flying. I want Air Force flying." He said, "Thank Christ for that." He said, "Blokes come in here with about 5 hours, and they think they know everything." Anyhow, I completed the old Tiger Moth course, the elementary flying school, and was posted to Maltese. So down we go to Point Cook, which is the original Air Force base when they started way back in about 1916. And we're flying Oxford aircraft, same as the British Oxford. And by the time we had completed our course, which would entail 2 to 3 hours a day at the most, I realised that we'd better get used to longer periods of flight. So we covered up with a mate, and we were detailed to fly 4 hours in the morning, sharing that time between us, and then 4 hours in the afternoon. And I remember getting home and thinking, these aeroplanes must cost more than £3 an hour. I'll put 4 times the amount. And I thought, well, that's 3/4 of 12. And the next thing, I was that damn tired, the next thing I woke up and I'd missed my tea. I finished the sum and said, well, 8 hours at £12 an hour, that's 96 quid's worth of flying I've had in one day. Oh, I thought that was really good, and I couldn't have cared less about tea. Anyway, Wings Parade, brevies, sergeant stripes, and up a spot of leave, and then up came postings. I was posted overseas, and which of course meant England, and our group had the good fortune to be posted onto a little passenger freighter which carried the 63 of us on board. Well, talk about a cook's tour. We had cabin boys, we had stewards, and crossing the line ceremony, and swimming pools erected for us. And we stooged off, and our first port of call was Wellington, New Zealand. We had a fortnight there. Then we up anchor and went to New Plymouth on the west coast of the North Island, and loaded frozen mutton for the UK. Then down to Christchurch on the east coast of the South Island, and we took on coal for the Pacific crossing. We were 3 weeks getting across there, pulled into Panama late, through the canal next day, and then were held up in Colon awaiting a small convoy. Leaving there, we stooged up through the Caribbean, which was known as Torpedo Alley, and the ship's crew used to remind us that there had been 700 ships sunk in that area up to that stage of the war. So we were a bit twitchy. Anyway, we finished up in New York, had about 3.5 days ashore, and then we put to sea in a 120 ship convoy. Now, the speed of a convoy is the fastest speed of the slowest ship, which in our case was 8 knots. And we went north into the higher latitudes to get away from the subpack. Horrendous storm. And the fast ships were losing way because their rudders weren't effective at this 8 knots. The Commodore split the convoy into two, and luckily our ship was fast enough to join the forward. We soldiered on, or I should say sailed on, and we finished up in Cardiff. There the Cardiff boys were a bit rough. They used to like beating up servicemen, and we weren't allowed ashore that night. Next morning we entrained, went to London, and then the following day we went down to Brighton, our reception centre. We were informed that there was a bottleneck in training due to weather and that we might be holed up there for a while. So it was during this hold-up time that I got onto a Ministry of Information tour and finished up in Grantham, Gainsborough, Grimsby, and realised there was such a place on the earth. Anyway, finally the bottleneck's cleared, and the authorities said, "You blokes haven't flown for nearly 6 months." It was for 13 weeks on our trip to England and about 3 months in Brighton, so we'll give you a refresher course. So the next thing, we posted to South Fernie in the Cotswolds, and the good old loyal Britishers, the Poms, the Canucks and the Aussies were posted out for the Satelliter, which of course was missing huts. And the weather was atrocious. The heating device, a little tiny coal stove, was only warm enough for the bloke sitting on it. The rest of us slept in flying boots and woolly bull flying gear. Anyhow, the weather was atrocious. Fog, rain, and we spent a lot of time digging trenches trying to drain the water off the aerodrome. Anyhow, we subsequently completed our refresher course in early spring and were all set to go to our new unit, which was Litchfield. It was an all-Australian unit and set aside for operational training, and this is where we met our crew. Up to then we'd all been individually trained. The selection of crews was quite a circus. All categories were put into a big hangar and told to walk around and find out the blokes you thought you'd like best. And then, of course, was their qualifications. And there'd be people looking furtively, and when you turn your eyes, they'd dodge away because they weren't too sure. And I was highly amused at the procedure, but it worked out, and we all eventually got into crews that we seemed to get along with. Except for the course was split into two, one half staying at Lisfield and the other going out to Church Broughton on the Toxteth Road. Guess who went out to the Satellite? Just SG. Anyhow, when we got there, we started our flying, and this is where the pilots came under a certain amount of scrutiny, sometimes severe, because up to this stage, the other categories had done their training with the experienced and highly trained staff pilots. Now they had their sprog pilot who had never flown a Wellington before, and fortunately, I think the training on circuits and bumps both day and night soon reassured them that their sprog pilot wasn't such sprog after all. When second bumps were completed, we started on our long-range high-altitude navigation exercises, both day and night, and high-altitude bombing and all the other facets of operational flying. And eventually completed the course and were waiting to go to conversion on 4-engine bombers. Okay. Before I leave Churchport, I'd like to mention that Rolls-Royce experimental aircraft were stationed at Church Broughton, and one of them was the small Gloucester single-engine jet, which did test flights day after day, and to see this little aircraft and its performance was utterly amazing. The rate of climb was incredible, far beyond anything we could have conceived. Another interesting aircraft there was a Wimpy fitted with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and a jet up the tail in the place of the rear turret. I never saw it fly, but rumours went around that one operational training pilot was stooging along, and the rear gunner reported that there was a Wimpy coming up astern and seemed to be closing fairly fast. As it got near enough, they saw that it had 2 props feathered. They couldn't believe their eyes, wondered what the hell was going on. And not until it overtook them and sort of zoomed away did they see the jet in the tail. What experiments they were doing, I don't know, but it was a very interesting looking aircraft. Our postings came down, we headed for Lincolnshire. This time we went to a place called Sandtoft, only for a week's holding until somebody knew where we were going. Then we went to Boston Park for another week and finally finished up at Brighton. Here we had the old obsolescent Halifaxes. They were powered with Merlin engines, and a peculiar looking thing to my point of view because it had 4 blades on the inners and 3 blades on the outers. These didn't seem to have the lusty roar as I found the Lancaster to have, and they seemed to wheeze down the runway, and I always felt that they would never get airborne. There's one little thing irritated me about the Halifax was the tiny little control wheel, which was in the shape of a bow tie, and it seemed so inadequate that I disliked it intensely. Anyhow, the brake levers were inside the bow tie-like wheel, and the locking device on this appalled me because I was a fitter and turner. I thought, surely to God they can get something better than this. You simply applied the brake levers to get the required pressure to hold the aircraft, and then there was like 2 nails held together by a little strip of metal and a spring on this, and to lock this huge aircraft you slipped it up against the spring, did half a turn and dropped 1 rusty nail through a little pinhole. Now this was the parking brake on an aircraft at over 100-foot wingspan, and I still haven't got over it. Heavy conversion unit was the same type of flying as we'd done at ATU, only that we were operating 4-engine aircraft. And after a period of time, it was completed, and we were then awaiting posting to our squadrons. I had hoped like hell that I'd get to a Lancaster group, and sure enough, I was posted to number 1 group and to their Lanc conversion or Lanc finishing school at Hemswell. This is interesting because we arrived late one evening. Next day we did our day circuit, and the next day we did night conversion, and the following day we're up for posting. Conversion simply consisted of a familiarisation flight with 8 landings in day and then 8 landings at night. The day that we called up the posting, I had hoped to go to 460, and matter of fact, I'd inquired if I could make an application, because that was the All-Australian Squadron. And I was assured that because I had an All-Australian crew, that there'd be no question, no need to lodge an application. So when I was called up, I said, 460? They said, no, Ludford Magna. I said, where the hell's that? And they said, next to Ludford Harbour. Well, I still had a blank look on my face and didn't have a clue. And I said, well, where's that? They said, you'll find out when you get there. So we trundled into this old truck with a canvas cover on the back, and we couldn't quite see where we were going except out the back. And we arrived at Ludford Magna, and later we found that it was about halfway through Market Raisin and Laos. There was another nest and hut joint, and the billets were on one side of the road and the hangars and airfield on the other. The main buildings in the little village of Ludford Magna was a church, a school, and a little general store with the Bowser on the curbside. Anyhow, we reported to the Adge, who had rather a faraway look in his eye when we approached him, and announced that we were a new crew, and he said, oh, we're pretty well off crews, although we lost 3 last night. You better take a week's leave. Well, we're astonished because we're itching to get stuck into this Lancaster Squadron. So away we went on leave, and when we came back, lo and behold, on the end of the runway was 2 Lancs on their bellies, resulting from an aborted show on Calais where the crews were ordered to land with their bombs rather than stirring the fish up in the wash. And 2 pilots, even though they're experienced, they didn't follow the handbook. Instead of 5 miles excess for the load, they came 15, and they floated like a tiger moth halfway down the runway, and then it was too late to go around, and too late to put the brakes on, so they pulled the wheels up, and there were 2 aircraft sitting there like lame ducks. Well, you can imagine our thoughts. 3 the day we arrived, 2 when we get back from leave, and we wondered what our chances would be. Up to this stage we had no engineer, and on arrival at 101 Squadron there was no choosing this time. We were issued with an engineer. His name was James Kilgallen, and he came from Geordieland, and he used to talk about driving buses down banks, and we thought, oh hell, he went over the side. But later we found that the bank was just a steep grade on the road. We were also issued with a special operator. His position in the aircraft was down behind the rear spar in the bowels of the aircraft, where he operated his radio sets, searching for jerry transmissions for their fighter squadrons. And if one located, he was able to throw a switch and jam out the transmissions. It was supposed to be a protection against fighter interception of the mainstream. But now back to our arrival at 101 Squadron. We had to do some further flights so that our standards could be assessed, and finally, when acceptable, we were announced operational. Well, then came the wait. The hooter would go, letting us know there's an op on. We'd trudge up to the flights, have a look. No, next time. And that happened for probably a week. And then finally there was a all-out effort called by Bomber Command, and I raced up, and the look on my face when I wasn't on must have got to the heart of the flight commander. And he said, listen, Gooding, there's a spare aircraft on A flight. It has only got 303s, But if you're prepared to fly that, you can go tonight. Well, we ever wrapped. I think we'd have even flown broomsticks to get on ops, because we'd been on the squadron at least a fortnight and hadn't been blooded. And incidentally, about a fortnight later, there's a power photograph in the paper with a Lank dropping its load. The cookie's about 6 feet below the bomb doors, and there's a shower of incendiaries around it. And believe it or not, it was S.R. Baker. But we weren't flying it on that particular occasion when the photograph was taken. However, I was able to get a copy from the papers and have a very good souvenir of the aircraft that I first took on ops. I'm ahead of myself again. I should have mentioned that before you're operational, you had to go with an experienced crew on one op. I think I was unlucky because the whole trip was only 3 hours, 10 minutes. The target was a communication aircraft field. We bombed at 10,000 feet. All I saw was a speckle of flak on the way in, then heard bomb doors open. There was a ruddy great glow of the markers underneath. Bombs gone, bomb doors closed, and on the way home I saw a glow in the air, which the skipper said was a fighter flare. 3 hours 10. I thought, my God, how experienced I am. I'll be able to give the crew every confidence in my experience. I'll switch off the Gooding story for a moment to give the complete contrast in new pilot experiences. It was told to me by a friend who flew at Kelston. The captain was again another Canadian, and this pilot was allotted to this particular flight. Everything was routine as they steamed down across England and the Channel, but not long after they passed the French coast, an engine failure occurred, and the new pilot looked towards the captain who said, "Feather." That duty done, he explained to the new pilot that they could climb on 3 and probably make 16,000 feet for the attack. However, on the run into the target area, they got the second engine shot out, whereupon the new pilot's eyebrows were considerably higher than they were before with this inquiring look. The captain said, "Feather, we'll bomb on 2 and lose a bit of height, but once we've lost their bombs, we'll be able to maintain level flight on 2. This was executed, but they'd got down to 12,000 feet and the light flak got stuck into them, shooting out the third engine. I believe the new pilot's eyebrows were much higher than they'd normally be worn when he looked to the skipper. The skipper said, "We'll lose height gradually, but we'll make France," which they did do, and landed in a paddy field with wheels up, all surviving the episode. How'd you like to be on this trip like that? Whilst on operational experience for new pilots, I eventually got to the stage where I was allotted a bloke, happened to be a fellow Australian, and the op happened to be the Duisburg Daylight, where Bomber Command rallied all its resources and we went in 1,000 strong. Well, this bloke had seen quite a few aeroplanes around the aerodrome, 30 or so of the squadron would come in or take off. But as we homed in on the group rendezvous, there was about 300 around, and he beautifully reported 3 o'clock up 200 aircraft, and he was reporting them all the time. But when we came into Reading, which was the rendezvous for the whole bomber stream, he'd forgot his precise reporting and says, "Holy hell, look at the buggers." He just couldn't believe it. Well, it was the first 1,000 bomber daylight I'd ever been on, and it was absolute incredible sight. you looked and you saw streaks here, streaks there, Lancasters here, Lancasters there, and as they went the distance, they became little tiny dots like insects on your windscreen. Well, nobody likes to be tail ass Charlie because everybody that survived an attack shoot at you, and nobody likes to be up in the front because everybody gets edgy and shoots at the first coming in. But there were so many ahead of us, I thought, God, I'm tail ass Charlie, and looked around and there was just as many behind me. I was just equally stunned with along with the new pilot. But I often think that when we went out 800 strong at night, there was just as many aeroplanes there, but you couldn't see the darn things. Now, for this particular raid, we took off 6 o'clock GMT, bombed at 9, back home at 12. We were told to get as much rest as we could. There might be something else on, and sure enough, that night they put another 1,000 bombers on, taking off at 6 p.m. and bombing at 9 p.m. and home by midnight. Unfortunately, we missed out. The rear gunner got dyspepsia there, and they wouldn't split crews at that stage of the game. But I'd love to have seen it or been on it, because the crews reported they could see the fires burning from 100 miles out. I don't know if you can imagine what groundwork went in: bombing, fueling, servicing engines, radios, and anything else that might be US. Then also to be considered as the admin side, coordinating dozens of squadrons to be at their respective target times. Then, of course, a force of 7,000 air crew to be fed, briefed, and jockeyed out to their respective aircraft. Before I get back to the Gooding crew with one operation on the board, I'll tell you a bit about the weather. The 44-45 winter was most severe. England, to keep aircraft operating with such conditions, we had snow plows to clear the main runway and the Perry track, but the track into the dispersal pans had to be cleared by air crew and ground crew together. We had a good ground crew, and after we'd cleared the track ready for taxiing out, we'd usually have a darn good snow fight. And then we'd go down to what the aircrew called their blood hut, a little shelter at the back of the aircraft, where they'd brew up a cup of tea and we'd swap yarns. Snow in itself was no hazard, it just meant a hell of a lot of extra work. The biggest hazard was fog. We could get off the ground by doing instrument takeoff, but to get back on the ground in fog was one of the big problems, and many an operation was timed so that we could get back in clear weather. However, to overcome this hazard of fog, Ludford was equipped with the Friday system. I'm not sure of the correct terminology, but we used to call it fog intent worth a log, and that was its purpose. It consisted of loops of 1-inch piping spaced regularly down either side of the runway, with little holes in through which they pumped pool petrol. And I believe they used to burn 60,000 gallons an hour when operating it. But it virtually cut a hole in the fog, a great big orange tunnel. I never landed on it, but I have done a couple of takeoffs. And here you'd bore down this orange-coloured tunnel, and then suddenly you'd go bang into the fog at the end, and at about 50 feet it brought out the best qualities of your instrument flying. I'm afraid I waffled on a bit there. I'll now get back to the Gooding crew with one operation on the board. We soldiered off 2 or 3 trips a week, and finally completed the tour with 30 trips to our credit. Our last trip was a little disappointing and uneventful. We churned into cloud as we crossed the channel and didn't get out of it until we came back over England. We had a bomb on our H2S radar, which is downward scanning. Bags of jubilation that night after our debriefing and sipping our cup of cocoa and rum, which was provided by the senior WAAF officer. She never missed a return of cruise. She was always there with a cheery hello and the bottle of rum. My wireless op didn't drink rum, so I used to get his ration, and by the time we were on our way down to have our ops meal, we were really quite gay. But the next morning, I felt unwanted almost. The hooter went, and instinctively I went to get out of bed and found that I had nothing to do. Now, everybody else was bustling around and sort of not interested in anything else but their own concern. And had somebody said, there's a spare aircraft, will you go? I think I'd have jumped in. But this feeling, it was quite unpleasant, really, so we took our ops leave almost immediately. And I was down in London for a couple of days where I bumped into this mate from Kelston and proudly announced that I had finished a tour. He had finished about a month previously, and I said, what the hell are you doing? He said, flying Spitfires. I said, how can you get onto those? And he pointed out that the fighter fill flights for each group were manned by fighter pilots until the front was opened, and then they were all dragged out for fighter duties in France, and that left the fighter fill flights a little bit short. And they called on interested bomber pilots, ex-tour, to come and fly. And he said, come up and have a yarn, you might get a job. So I went back early and called in at Scampton, located the fighter fill flight and the flight commander, and pointed out that my singles experience was limited to light aircraft, the Tiger Moth and a few others of the same type, and what I lacked in experience I'd make up in upper keenness. Anyhow, he seemed quite interested and said, well, we'll let you know. When I got back to Ludford, I went up to see if I was being posted, and the ad says, yes, you're on Dakotas. I said, oh, good, strike me pink. What about holding it up for a couple of days, because I think I could get onto Spitz on the fighter fill flight. He was a good sport and put my posting on the bottom of his pile, and within a couple of days, it was announced that I was posted to fighter fill flight Scampton. Well, boy, was I ever rapt. Now, John, before I leave Ludford Magna, I'd like to tell you a bit about night operations flying in a stream, so you can appreciate a couple of little experiences I had that I think you might be interested in. Now, before the 4-engine aircraft were available, Wimpeys, Whitleys and other twin-engine bombers made up the force. And with their limited range, they had to fly a direct route to the target and home. Now, the old Jerry was a resourceful foe, and he'd very soon pick up the intended target, and he'd have time to rally his defences. And these poor buggers, they fought their way into the target through searchlight, barrages, anti-aircraft and fighters, and then they turned around and fought their way home, and they had just one hell of a time. But I was lucky with the 4-engine aircraft making up the force. We had increased range, and we were able to use a tactic which caused Jerry to disperse his defences. Now, the idea was that we'd head for a possible target, and then just out of fighter range from that target, we'd dogleg onto another possible target, and perhaps even the third or fourth time we'd repeat this. And Jerry was never sure of the target until we actually struck. Whilst this lessened the opposition to our attack, it introduced another hazard, and that was a collision on the dogleg point. The stream is normally up to 4 miles wide, and some blokes may be turning early, some late, and some on time, but it brings the aircraft into a crossing situation. Now, on this particular occasion, I'm not sure whether we had turned or whether we were coming up to turn, but we're stooging along perfectly clear windscreen, and suddenly a blur swept across in front of me, and instantly after the blur had passed, I crashed through the 4 slipstreams, which shook the old aircraft like a jeep going over gutters at 60 miles an hour. Had we been a second faster, or he had been a second slower, we'd have minced ourselves up in one almighty heap. Now, this did occur because one night when we lost 2 aircraft on the one raid, they found the 2 aircraft tangled together on a turning point, so that you can see it was quite a hazard and an interesting experience. The bomb owner, being nearest to the incident, recoiled from his couch almost back onto the steps up into the cockpit. Years later, he called in to see me on his way through to Melbourne, and I asked him if he could recall that instant when the bloke swept across our bows. He says, "Indeed I do. Only the laundryman and myself knew my total reaction." The next interesting experience was on our 25th trip. We were stooging into the target on a dark, clear night, and we had about 20 minutes to fly to the target when the engineer pointed an aircraft exactly parallel to us, same height, and pacing us perfectly. Usually aircraft are stooging a bit forward or back or going up or down, but this bloke was pacing us, so I kept my eye on him, and he was closing in because we were both heading for the target area. And I said to the nav, "I think I'll go down 200 feet, there's a bloke crowding me on the starboard, and I'll get out of his way." Well, I dropped down the 200 feet, and I was just fiddling about to put in George, and the engineer thumped me on the shoulder and pointed up, and here was this aircraft hurtling down in what we call the first stage of his corkscrew evasion tactics. Well, my only instinct was to go with him and try and match his speed. Well, that is speed of descent. And I did that at possibly the last possible moment. I finished up shadow formating with him. I was underneath, and I feared that our props would intertangle like gear wheels. And I stuck with him, and then either he slipped or I skidded, and as we went out, we raked him right across from the port inner engine to the starboard outer, including the bomb bays as well, and he slid away. We lost the entire wingtip, which was about 8 feet, because it had no spar in it. But as we departed, as we found out later, his starboard outer had sliced about 6 feet off the leading edge. Well, talk about an exciting experience. I rolled the old Lanc back into level flight, and it reacted all right, so we did our little jaunt over the target and got back home. On debriefing, the brass thought I was a clever bugger, but the hero really was the old engineer, James Kilgallen from Durham. If he hadn't spotted that aircraft when he did, I just couldn't have matched the rate of descent, and there'd have been 2 more airplanes tangled up. I think the old Grim Reaper had messed up his computer somewhere, because it was only a matter of a second of that and the previous incident. The next morning, news filtered through about this other aircraft, and he came from Hemsworth. And as we had the day off, we went over and had a look at the aircraft that nearly swiped us off. The pilot had claimed that he was evading a fighter attack, and he never saw us, and thought he had been hit by flak. Of course, when he got home, he realised that he had our mark on his underwing and bomb bays, etc. I believe the poor bloke, he was on his 15th, but I don't think he survived the tour. Just one more interesting experience, John. We were operating on a target beyond a huge bank of cloud. It had closed in over England, and on the return from the raid, as we approached the French coast, we got the only communication from base. It said, descend to 1,500 feet over the channel and proceed to base at that altitude, icing index severe, which meant if we'd gone back at 18,000 feet as brief, we could have iced up to such an extent that the aircraft would be uncontrollable. Anyhow, we obeyed this instructions, and we were still in cloud at 1,500 feet, and that's the ordinary circuit height of aircraft. Anyway, I realised there's 300 other bods on the raid, and here we are stooging along in cloud on the instruments, all going up towards Lincolnshire. And I must admit I felt a bit twitchy, but consoled myself when I thought, well, the other 299 blokes will be twitching as much as myself and be on the alert. Anyhow, we all arrived back successfully at base and had no losses. After all that, John, I better get you over to Scampton where the fight was still based. I arrived there about midday, and after lunch found my way up to the flight, and shortly after, the flight commander said, just come up the hangar and have a look at the aircraft. So he sat me in a hurricane and said, get your cockpit drill off, and I'll check you out later. Anyhow, I went through all the old hatch, harness, hydraulics, trim mixture, pitch fill, flap sperry, and had that pretty well taped. The next morning, the flight commander said, bring your parachute up and I'll check you out. I started on the cockpit drill, and he said, yeah, that's okay, but the thing you got to watch is the down lock on your undercarriage. You can't get it up unless you trip that when you take off. Then he said, you've been studying 4 millions for the last 6 months. This is the same. Kick her over and go for a flight. Don't do any circuits. Just get up and get familiar with your aircraft. Well, I couldn't believe it. Back home here, we'd have done a full fighter conversion course, and here I was, a fortnight out of Lancaster's, and they're saying, hop in and have a go. And this is the thing I liked about the POM. You're a pilot, you can fly. But the POM weren't quite so high in my appreciation. For some unknown reason, they put you in an aircraft to be flown with the right hand, and they put the undercarriage and flap control on the right hand, which necessitated taking your hands off, changing over the left hand, and getting the undercarriage up. Both the Spitty and the Hurricane had this peculiarity. It wasn't really conducive to safety, because just at the critical point of takeoff, you got to whip over the left hand and then fumble for the undercarriage. And this is exactly what I did. I lined up, opened the throttle, before I knew where I was airborne. And I started to fumble for the undercarriage, forgot about the lock, and I porpoised away through the sky to about 1,000 feet before I remembered the lock on the undercarriage lever. When I tucked that away, I climbed up through the clouds and had one glorious hour. I looped and I barrel rolled and I charged the clouds and turned away and chased the clouds for this one glorious hour. On return, I tucked in what I thought was a tight circuit, landed, and I was absolutely elated. A boyhood dream had come true. On return to the flight commander had a sneak look at my circuit, and he says, you bloody bomber pilots, you take up half the country. He said, tomorrow, go and do circuits and bumps in the Hurricane. He said, but tuck in close. He said, steep climbing turns off the deck and a good steep approach for the landing. So next morning out I go, and I had another wizard of a time. Imagine doing about a 4-mile circuit, and here I was doing it within about half a mile or even a quarter of a mile. It was another dream come true. After I'd completed another couple of hours in the Hurricane, the flight commander said, "How'd you like to have a go at a Spit?" And sure enough, the next thing I'm taxiing out in the Spitfire, and the undercarriage incident caused a rather ungainly takeoff, and I virtually flapped my way down the runway, and at the bottom of one of the flaps I shot into the air, couldn't find the undercarriage lever, but again, that was soon overcome. Now, with the Spit, we didn't do circuits in bumps because it was hot weather, and the so-called flap dropped down behind the radiator, restricting the flow, and if you didn't get your temperature down on the approach, the Spit was prone to boiling on the taxi run into the hangars. If this occurred, the drill was to cut the motor and sit there and get towed in back to the flight. I got caught out a couple of times. But halfway through that period, we moved up to Hemswell. To me, it was like being in an aero club with Spitfires as our personal steeds and not having to pay a penny to fly these glorious machines here, there and everywhere. From my point of view, the Spitfire was the most perfect aircraft to fly. It was light and sensitive, and it became an extension of oneself. If I thought of a manoeuvre, I'd find myself halfway through it. It seemed to respond to thought rather than to manipulation of the controls. Many of our pilots were not much better than bus drivers. They'd hardly banked the aeroplane, but whenever I got airborne, I seldom flew straight and level. I used to cavort all over the sky, and I sit back sometimes and reminisce about the delight of this wonderful aircraft. Alas, all good things come to an end, and when the war finished, I said a sad farewell to Spits. I was posted back to Brighton for re-embarkation. When the due processes were complete, 3,000 enlisted and trained for Liverpool, where we boarded a 27,000-ton ship, the Andes, for our journey home. We shooked out into the Atlantic and steezed across to Panama and back through Wellington in New Zealand and thence to Sydney town. The only welcome we got was a splash in the paper next day, 3,000 picked airmen home to wage war against the Japs. But as it so happened, whilst we were on home leave, the Jap war finished and we were surplus to requirement. The big demob started, and I thought that this is the end of my 3 glorious years in the Air Force. But fortune intervened, and that bloke that introduced me to Fighter Phil lived in Sydney and invited me to a party. On the way home, he ran up a telly post. He was a pretty quick driver. And I sustained bad facial injuries, which put me in hospital. And when my discharge notice came through, I was still not fit. And the good old RAAF says, we'll discharge you in the same physical condition as when you came in. So I was languishing away in hospital, recovering, and lo and behold, up came a notice calling for applications to go to Japan, flying Mustang. And this is another story. I've just checked the tape and I've got half of the second side left. And at the risk of boring you silly, John, I'll nip through my post-war service in the RAAF. How about that? After being discharged from hospital, I was subsequently posted to Williamtown, our fighter base, which is just north of Newcastle. And we went through the official fighter conversion course, and On completion, we posted to the SS Manura, a jazzed-up troop ship, and with only about 50 people on, we had a leisurely trip for 3 weeks heading for Japan. Our station was a place called Bofu, ex-Jap training airfield, and we spent about 9 months there and later went to Iwakuni, where we spent another 9 months. Our job was to patrol the prefectures to see if there were no uprising, and fortunately there was no evidence of that whatsoever. But in so doing, we swept all of the southwest of the main island and became very familiar with it. Our other activities were to liaise with the Yanks, and if they had any celebration, we'd take off with 36 aircraft like a flock of pigeons, fly to their drome and be entertained by them for any occasion that they thought worthwhile. We, of course, returned the compliments and had many a visit from the Yanks Squadron. They, by the way, had a lot of bombers, but their fighter force was all Mustangs, so we had a great liaison with their fighter pilots. Now, the Mustang was a beautiful aeroplane, but not in the class of Spitfire for agility. It was positive, reliable, sturdy, and incidentally, the undercarriage lever was on the left, and you didn't have to change hands at takeoff. Our social life was a bit limited because we were confined to our camp, but to compensate that, we had leave centres here and there, which are the main areas for the tourist industry now existing in Japan. It was a bit embarrassing having to take leave about every 2 months, but we put up with such hardships. Anyhow, after the 18 months there, I posted back home to Australia with no specific job, but whilst on leave I got posted to the City of Sydney Squadron, just out of Sydney, the post called Schofield. I had the doubtful honour of being the commanding officer. The 2 previous pilots posted in there had killed themselves, and here I was, CO of the squadron, and I had Tiger Moths, Wirraways and Mustangs to fly. When the permanent CO was posted in, I wasn't particularly happy with him. I'd known him in Japan. He had his own aircraft. He'd been there for about 3 years and had 5 hours a year flying in it. And people who don't fly aeroplanes are not friends of mine. I applied for a posting and finished up in Melbourne at a place called ARDU, Aircraft Research and Development. I had no special qualification. I was just a hack pilot flying this aeroplane and that one. My job finished up at Malaya, a dirt strip in north of Adelaide, and our job there was to carry new bombs which were being fitted with special fins for high altitude work. And we weren't equipped really for the job, and we had old Lincolns which we dragged up to 32,000 feet, dropping these new stores and photographing the effects of the fins on the new missiles. So I had a great time there. One day you'd fly the Lincoln as captain, next day second, and then we had a Mustang with a horizontally mounted camera which would formate with the Lincoln just as it's about to drop and photograph the vertical oscillations of the bomb. And so on the third day, you'd fly the Mustang. And the variation of flying a fighter and a bomber kept you really on the ball. I can remember one sortie on a perfectly clear day with unlimited visibility. I had turned away from the last sortie and pointed southwards, I could see the entire coast of South Australia, and with its gulfs and it's a small island, Kangaroo Island, off the coast. And at the tip of Spencer's Gulf was a town called Port Augusta. And I knew that our range was about 100 miles from there, so I thought, oh, well, I'll see how quickly I can get to Port Augusta. I pointed the nose down at about a 20-degree angle and trimmed the aircraft pointing to point at Port Augusta, and just let the old Mustang churn along. I was there in a quarter of an hour, which is not a bad average speed, and it's the fastest I think I've ever travelled. I enjoyed this job, but unfortunately I'd got rather plump at this particular station, and one day in the Lincoln I developed choke. It's similar to bends in a diver, causes vomiting, and I thought it was just a passing phase. It wouldn't occur the second time. I realised anyone in that condition was a darn pest after all the preparations had been made to get the sorting on. So I was limited then to 25,000 unpressurised aircraft. So I was surplus to requirements once again, and eventually a posting came onto Lincoln at our bomber base, Amberley, just west of Brisbane. They were forming up crews to relieve the one squadron crews which had been supporting the British bombing actions against the bandits in the jungle of Malaya. It was very much like police action. The army would set out a target area, we'd go and bomb it, and then the army would go and clean up. And I was eventually detailed to take my aircraft up, and I had the pleasure of flying from Amberley to Darwin and then across the Timor Sea, Indonesian waters into Singapore. I was there for 8 months, during which time I knocked up 68 sorties. And after what we did in Europe, it was really just playing around, having a lot of fun dropping bombs, because there's utterly no opposition whatsoever. On return to Australia, I applied for an instructor's course and was posted to a place called East Sale at our Central Flying School. Having completed that, we then were posted to Point Cook for a short period of time and completed the course that was already underway. And then we went to a place called Quinty, which is in central New South Wales area, absolutely flat country, adjacent to the town of Wagga Wagga. And we proceeded to train pilots from initial flying to advanced flying and finally to their wing standard. We flew Tiger Moths for the initial flying training and then converted to Wirraways, which is very much like the Miles Master, which was used for the same purpose in England. And after 2 courses, the boffins in the headquarters wanted a pilot who could fly Mustangs, Lincolns, and was an instructor. And I found myself posted in number 10 Squadron, which is a maritime reconnaissance squadron based at Garbutt, right on the boundaries of the city of Townsville in Queensland. Our job was maritime reconnaissance and search and rescue aircraft. This entailed flying to Darwin, staying there a month, patrolling certain areas of the sea, particularly when the Jap fleets were there in big numbers. And then we were training for maritime reconnaissance, which requires flying at 800 feet, the best height for observing dinghies or submarines or whatever. And here I blotted my copybook badly. As the instructor, I was checking a bloke out, and the brand spanking near Lincoln with only 16 hours on the logbook, and I pranged it. The aircraft was utterly ripped apart, the nose was wrenched off, half a wing was broken off, the fuselage broke its tail, and the four of us in the aircraft got out with minor injuries. The Court of Inquiry found that the accident was due to pilot error, which is an acceptable excuse. No disciplinary action was taken. I continued flying there for about another 6 months, but as I was approaching retirement age, I started to think about extending that by transferring to engineering. And I applied for a review on my qualifications for engineer officer. It was posted back to Amberley, the bomber base. I'm afraid when I got stuck into it, I found that engineer officers weren't really engineers, they were administrators. And I wasn't that enthusiastic and subsequently was not accepted. So I'm hanging around the place, and my last posting was to a little place called Rathmines on the big lake just west of Newcastle. It used to be a Catalina flying base, and it was at this time being used for officer and NCO training course. I was posted down there as one of the staff, and one of my duties was to fly the small Oster aeroplane. And I was communications pilot, and used to stooge around, and at times I'd take a test flight and just fly around this beautiful lake waving to the fishermen, who were in plenty. And I continued there right up until I reached the age of retirement, and my Air Force career came to an end. I had 3 months long service leave, and I built a caravan and decided to stooge around for 3 months until I found out what I really wanted to do. However, we called on my sister-in-law, and her husband was teaching the tech, and he knew I had a fitting and turning background, and said, "Did I ever think of teaching?" And I thought, oh God, I hadn't. And he told me that the secondary schools wanted tradesmen to teach craft. And the more I thought about it, the better it seemed. Holidays at the same time, plenty of kids, and plenty of holidays at that. And when I applied and said that I'd like a country centre, the old heads of the education department were saying, well, let's sign here, because the average teacher wants to go to the city. And after a period of time, approaching the near school year, I was asked if I'd accept the position at Namurka High School. I said yes. So we stooged down here, lived in the caravan till we got a schoolhouse, and I spent 20 years teaching kids fitting and turning, sheet metal work, mechanical drawing, etc. And after 21 years, I did the second retirement, and by that time we'd become well established in a small country town of about 2,500 people. It's a pleasant little spot. We have a creek running through the place, which is our water supply. We have a huge lake, 54 acres, man-made for recreation, and there's every sport you can imagine. Fishing, shooting, boating, tennis, football, hockey, cricket, swimming, squash, basketball, and quite a few others I haven't mentioned. So if you want to retire to a good spot, just come along to Namurka and have a look at it. But at the moment, it's stinking hot, 40 degrees, and I'm going outside into the kitchen where we've got a cooling device to refresh myself. Now, John, there's a bit of tape left, so I thought I'd use it up by taking you back to the situation I found myself in after the Lincoln praying. So, on this particular flight, I didn't zip up the pocket in which I carried my wallet, and in the praying, of course, it flicked out and was lost. Now, my concern personally was that I had 25 quid in it, which I was to carry as an emergency fund. And despite the fact that I'd written off £125,000 worth of aircraft, I became a bit obsessed about losing this week's pay. And I fear I was becoming an utter bore. Any opportunity I'd bring the conversation around to my 25 quid. And the copper did me a great favour. I was about to open up on the 25 quid story, and he said, "For Christ's sake, shut up. You wouldn't get a ride like that at Luna Park for 100 quid. And such is mateship, and I was most grateful to him for pulling me into line. Finally, in a town of our size, one hears things said about oneself, and I've heard it said that if Syd Gooding is asked about an aeroplane, he'll bash your ears for 2 hours solid. I'll leave it to you to judge. All the best, John." Postscript. I've just listened to the whole of this tape and realised that my recording technique is pretty crook. I had thought of doing it again, but I don't think my technique would have improved much in another go. However, I'm satisfied with the story. It is as I wanted it, and after all, the story is the main reason for making this tape. So with apologies, this is SG signing on. Cheers.
morning. To those of you who don't know me, my name is Harry Baker. I'm an ex-student of Syd's and an old friend. And just while I'm speaking of ex-students, on behalf of all ex-students, to Syd, thank you. Syd retired from the Air Force in 1956, but his love of aviation stayed with him. He went flying when he could with some of his many aviator friends. I had the privilege of taking him flying many times in the last 40 years. His last flight was with me on his 87th birthday in September 2002. Although he was legally blind, I was able to use my eyes for him and talk him through the takeoff, the rest of the flight including several turns, and the approach and landing. Syd used the controls with a gentle touch and was thrilled in particular about the landing. I had not touched the controls. He had flown the whole flight from takeoff to landing. That flight was one I will never forget. Syd's lifetime covered the development of aviation, and he was one of the pioneers. He had flown aircraft at various times over a 70-year period and had heard and seen aeroplanes from the Bristol monoplane, one of the earliest in Australia, to the high-speed pass of the F-111 over Numurkah a few weeks ago. That is a huge achievement, and I'm sure he wouldn't have missed it for the world.
This is SG signing on. Cheers.